Can a satanic priest ever become a saint? The answer lies in the extraordinary life of Bartolo Longo, a man who descended into the very depths of the occult, only to ascend as one of the greatest apostles of the Rosary. His story defies all human logic and proves that no soul is so lost that divine mercy cannot reach it. Born in southern Italy in 1841, this lawyer traveled the darkest path imaginable before finding the light that would transform him into an instrument of salvation for millions. Chapter 1. The Dark Years. Bartolo Longo was born on February 10, 1841, in Latiano, near Brindisi, into a profoundly Catholic family. His father, Dr. Bartolomeo Longo, and his mother, Antonina Luparelli, raised their children in faith, praying the Holy Rosary together as a family each night. Their childhood home was a haven of peace, where the image of the Virgin Mary presided over everything. However, when Bartolo was only 10 years old, his mother passed away, leaving a void that would shape the course of his youth. Young Bartolo was educated by the Piarist fathers, initially maintaining the faith of his childhood. He was a brilliant student, gifted with keen intelligence and a special sensitivity. But upon arriving in Naples in 1862 to study law at the university, he encountered an environment completely different from his hometown. The city was seething with the anti-clerical ideas of Italian unification, and General Giuseppe Garibaldi was leading an open rebellion against the Pope and the Church. In that cauldron of political and spiritual revolutions, Bartolo met professors who openly scorned the Catholic faith. One of them gave him Ernest Renan's Life of Jesus, a work that denied the divinity of Christ and reduced the gospel to a mere human story. Those poisonous pages began to erode the faith that his mother had planted in his heart. The young university student began to doubt, to question, to drift away from prayer. It was then that spiritualism, spreading like a plague throughout Europe, caught his attention. He began attending seances out of mere intellectual curiosity, attracted by the promise of contacting the invisible world. Those meetings in dark rooms, with tables that moved and voices that emerged from the shadows, fascinated him. What began as a game became an obsession. Bartolo delved deeper and deeper into occult practices, convinced that he possessed supernatural powers. The fall was swift and terrible. Bartolo Longo was formally ordained as a satanic priest within a pagan group. He came to lead blasphemous rituals, to pronounce invocations against God and the Church, to immerse himself in the deepest darkness of the occult. He would later confess that during this period he was an authentic priest of Satan, consecrated to the service of evil. His soul, which had known the sweetness of his mother's prayer, now dwelled in the abyss, and the consequences were not long in coming. For about a year and a half, Bartolo lived immersed in this world of darkness. His university colleagues, many of them idealistic young people attracted to the anti-clerical trend, did not understand the depth of the abyss into which he had thrown himself. While they were playing with philosophical ideas about the non-existence of God, Bartolo had crossed a much more dangerous line. He had come into direct contact with the forces of evil. The rituals he presided over were not simple theatrical performances, but true demonic invocations that left invisible but real marks on his soul. The light that once shone in his eyes as a child, when he prayed with his mother, had been completely extinguished, replaced by an empty, tormented gaze. Chapter 2. The Encounter That Changed Everything. Bartolo's health began to deteriorate alarmingly. His body was wasting away, reduced to skin and bones. He suffered terrible nightmares, tormenting visions that woke him in the middle of the night, soaked in a cold sweat. Paranoia invaded him. He felt evil presences that were constantly stalking him. Remorse began to tear at his conscience. He had arrived at the university as a bright, young Catholic, Now he was a human specter, tormented by forces he could no longer control. In the midst of that inner hell, something extraordinary happened. One night, in the paroxysm of his despair, Bartolo had a vision of his deceased father. The paternal voice resounded in his soul with terrible clarity. "Return to God! Return to God!" Those words shook him to his foundation. For the first time in years, the young man felt a glimmer of hope in the midst of the darkness. But the way back seemed impossible. How could God forgive someone who had been a satanic priest, a former professor of his? Vincenzo Pepe learned of the situation in which his brilliant student found himself. Far from abandoning him, he sought him out and confronted him harshly. "You are going straight to eternal perdition. If you don't react now, you will be lost forever." Those words, spoken with firm love, penetrated Bartolo's heart. The professor did not judge him, nor condemn him, but took him by the hand and led him to a Dominican priest named Alberto Redente. Father Redente was a man of profound spiritual wisdom and infinite patience. He was not scandalized when he heard Bartolo's confession. He did not recoil at the magnitude of his sins. Instead, he spoke to him of the infinite mercy of God, of how Jesus had come precisely to seek the lost. He explained that no sin, however grave, was beyond divine forgiveness, and he gave him a powerful spiritual weapon, the Holy Rosary. "Pray every day. Count the beads with your fingers. Repeat the prayers of Mary," he said. Bartolo began to pray with trembling hands. At first, the words of the Hail Mary took a titanic effort. The mysteries of the Rosary seemed distant, almost incomprehensible. But he persevered day after day, clinging to those beads like a shipwrecked man to a piece of driftwood. Slowly, very slowly, the light began to filter into his soul. On October 7th, 1871, Bartolo Longo publicly renounced spiritualism, declaring before witnesses, "I renounce spiritualism because it is nothing more than a labyrinth of errors and of falsehoods." That same day, he entered as a Dominican tertiary, taking the name Brother Rosary. The transformation was not instantaneous or easy. For months, Bartolo struggled against the temptations to go back, against the inner voices that whispered that his conversion was useless, that he was doomed anyway. There were nights when he woke up terrified, feeling that the dark forces he had served were claiming him as their own. In those moments of spiritual agony, he would clutch the rosary to his chest until the beads left marks on his skin, praying with a desperation that touched heaven itself. Father Redente patiently accompanied him on this inner journey, constantly reminding him that God's mercy is greater than any sin. Little by little, the nightmares became less frequent, the temptations lost their power, and an unknown peace began to settle in his martyred heart. Chapter 3. The Cursed Valley. In October of 1872, Bartolo Longo traveled to the Valley of Pompeii to handle some legal matters for Countess Mariana de Fusco, a pious widow who needed help managing her properties. What he discovered there profoundly impacted him. Pompeii wasn't just an archaeological site buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, it was also a living region, submerged in the most absolute spiritual and material misery. The peasants in the valley lived in almost total religious ignorance. Many didn't know how to make the sign of the cross, were unfamiliar with the most basic prayers, and had never seen a priest. The area was virtually abandoned by the church, considered a no-man's land. Pagan superstitions mixed with remnants of a deformed Catholic faith. The poverty was extreme. Entire families lived in miserable shacks. Children wandered around dirty and malnourished. Disease and hopelessness reigned everywhere. As Bartolo walked through those desolate fields, he felt an oppression in his chest. The contrast between the glorious ruins of ancient Roman Pompeii and the misery of contemporary Pompeii was heartbreaking. One day, as he crossed the valley under a leaden sky, He felt overwhelmed by the desolation of the place and of his own life. He stopped in the middle of the road, surrounded by barren fields, and fell to his knees. The former satanic priest, now converted but tormented, cried out to heaven, begging for a sign. It was then that he heard an inner voice, clear and sweet, like no other he had ever heard. It wasn't an audible voice, but a certainty that flooded his entire soul. If you spread the rosary, you will be saved. The words resonated deep within his being, with an authority that admitted no doubt. It was the voice of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, speaking directly to his heart. Bartolo understood in that instant what his mission would be for the rest of his life. He rose from the ground, transformed. He was no longer simply a man repenting of his dark past. Now, he was a man with a divine mission. The cursed valley of Pompeii would become the stage for his redemption and his apostolate. That barren and forgotten land would flourish thanks to the power of the Rosary. Bartolo Longo didn't yet know how he would achieve it. He had no resources or influence, but he had something infinitely more powerful, a promise from heaven and a rosary in his hands. That afternoon, sitting on an ancient stone that perhaps had been part of a Roman villa 2,000 years ago, Bartolo contemplated the valley with new eyes. Where before he only saw desolation, now he saw possibility. Where before he perceived abandonment, now he sensed a fertile field for grace. He understood that God had brought him precisely to that place, because his personal story and the story of Pompeii reflected each other. Both had been buried under the ashes of destruction. Both seemed doomed to oblivion, but both were called to resurrect. Ancient Pompeii had been devastated by the fire of the volcano. The new Pompeii would be regenerated by the fire of the Holy Spirit. And he, Bartolo Longo, former servant of darkness, would be the chosen instrument for this marvelous work. Pause for reflection. Bartolo, a former satanic priest, has just heard the Virgin's promise. If you spread the rosary, you will be saved. Had you heard of Saint Bartolo Longo before this video? Share in the comments. Your story may be the light someone needs today. If this story is impacting you, leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. Let's continue together. Chapter 4. A Heavenly Voice. The certainty of his mission didn't immediately dispel the doubts that assailed Bartolo. The memories of his satanic past tormented him like relentless demons. On sleepless nights, the voices of the abyss whispered in his mind, "You are a priest of Satan. That consecration is irreversible. You are lost forever." The anguish became so intense that Bartolo contemplated suicide, thinking it was the only way out for a soul as stained as his. But the heavenly voice he had heard in the valley didn't abandon him. Whenever despair overwhelmed him, those words resonated again within him. If you spread the rosary, you will be saved. It wasn't a conditional or uncertain promise. It was an absolute guarantee of salvation. The Virgin Mary wasn't asking him to be perfect, only to be faithful in spreading devotion to the rosary. Bartolo clung to that promise like an anchor in the midst of the storm. He began to preach the rosary among the peasants of Pompeii with a fervor that surprised everyone. This man, who had been in the depths of spiritual hell, spoke of Mary with a conviction that moved the most hardened hearts. He taught prayer to those who had never learned, explained the mysteries of Christ's life with a clarity that came from his own experience of conversion. The peasants listened to him, fascinated. He organized prayer groups in the most humble homes. Families gathered at sunset, after the labors of the field, to recite the rosary together. At first there were few, but the number grew. The beads of the rosary passed from hand to hand, from parents to children, from neighbors to neighbors. Bartolo had discovered that the most powerful weapon against the devil was precisely the one that the Virgin Mary had put in his hands. The same rosary that had saved him would now save Pompeii. However, Bartolo knew that his mission needed something more, a focal point for devotion, a place where the faithful could direct their prayers. Pompeii needed an image of Our Lady of the Rosary, a sanctuary where the Mother of God would be honored. But how to get a worthy image if he had hardly any resources? Bartolo began to pray, asking that Providence send what was needed. He didn't imagine the surprising way in which his prayer would be heard. Bartolo's transformation into a preacher of the Rosary astonished those who had known him in his university years. Some of his former spiritualist companions, upon learning of his conversion, traveled to Pompeii to confront him, accusing him of being a traitor and a coward. Bartolo received them with meekness, without anger or resentment. He spoke to them of his own experience, of how spiritualism had led him to the very edge of the abyss, of how only God's mercy and the Rosary of Mary had rescued him. Some scoffed and walked away, their hearts hardened in their error. Others, however, were struck by the peace that emanated from this man, a man they remembered as tormented and desperate. Several of these former companions ended up following in his footsteps toward conversion, proving that the testimony of a transformed life is more eloquent than 1,000 theological arguments. Chapter 5. The Discarded Painting. In 1875, Bartolo Longo expressed his desire to obtain an image of the Virgin of the Rosary to Father Alberto Redente, his spiritual director. The Dominican priest promised to look for something suitable. Weeks later, he wrote to him saying that he had found a painting in an antique shop in Naples. However, the description he gave of the painting was far from flattering. It was in a deplorable state, dirty, torn in several places, with flaking paint. It had been discarded as garbage. When Bartolo Longo first saw that image, his heart sank. The canvas was so deteriorated that the figures were barely distinguishable. The Virgin Mary held the child Jesus, while Saint Dominic and Saint Catherine of Siena received the Rosary. But the whole thing seemed about to disintegrate. Any sane person would have rejected that ruined painting. But Bartolo, with the eyes of faith, saw something different. He saw a sign of divine providence. He understood that this mistreated image was like a mirror of his own life. He too had been a reject, a discarded soul, a man ruined by sin, and yet the mercy of God had restored him. In the same way, this despised painting would be restored and would become a source of blessings for thousands of souls. Bartolo accepted the image with tears of gratitude and hired a painter to restore it with great care and diligence. On November 13th, 1875, the restored image arrived in Pompeii in a cart pulled by mules. There was no solemn procession or grandiose ceremony. The painting was placed in the small parish church on a modest altar. The peasants who saw it were not impressed by its artistic quality, which remained mediocre. But something extraordinary began to happen. Those who prayed before that image experienced profound conversions, inexplicable healings, miraculous consolations. A mother brought her epileptic daughter before the image of the Virgin of the Rosary and prayed with desperate faith. The girl, named Clorinda Lucarelli, 12 years old, had suffered terrible seizures for years. After praying the entire rosary before the painting, the little girl was completely cured. It was the first officially documented miracle. The news spread like wildfire throughout the region. People began to flock to Pompeii, not to see the Roman ruins, but to pray before that image that God had chosen to manifest his power. The journey of the image from Naples to Pompeii had been an adventure in itself. The cart that transported it got stuck several times on the muddy road, and at one point it seemed that the painting would fall and be damaged even further. But every time an obstacle arose, someone providentially appeared to help. A farmer lent his oxen, another offered stronger ropes. A group of workers pushed the cart out of the mud. Bartolo, who accompanied the image throughout the journey, saw the hand of providence in each of these incidents. When the painting was finally placed on the altar of the small parish church, Bartolo knelt before it and wept with emotion. He knew that that moment marked the beginning of something great, although he could not yet imagine the magnitude of what was to come. The Virgin Mary had come to Pompeii to stay, and with her came the hope of redemption for that forgotten valley. Chapter 6. The First Miracles. The testimonies of graces received began to multiply in an astonishing way. A blind woman regained her sight after praying a novena before the image. A paralyzed man abandoned his crutches after entrusting his cause to the Virgin of the Rosary of Pompeii. But the most impressive miracles were not only physical, but spiritual. Hardened sinners confessed after decades. Broken marriages were reconciled. Young people lost in vice found the path of virtue. Bartolo carefully documented each case, collecting signed testimonies and medical verifications when possible. He did not want people to talk about superstitions or fantasies, but about real and verifiable facts. Doctors were baffled by cures that defied all scientific explanation. Confessor priests testified to conversions so profound and sudden that they could only be attributed to a direct divine intervention. A particularly moving case was that of a man who had been a spiritualist, like Bartolo himself in his youth. This individual arrived in Pompeii, dragging invisible spiritual chains, tormented by the same dark forces that had tormented Bartolo years before. By praying the Rosary before the image of the Virgin, he felt as if those chains were breaking one by one. He confessed his sins with bitter tears and left the sanctuary transformed into a new man. Bartolo recognized his own story in him and gave thanks to God. The small parish church was already insufficient to house the pilgrims who arrived daily. Bartolo realized that he needed to build a worthy sanctuary for the Virgin of the Rosary. But where would he get the money? He was not a rich man, and the Countess de Fusco, although generous, could not finance such a large work alone. Bartolo decided to trust in the same providence that had sent him the mistreated image. He began to ask for alms, not only among the rich, but especially among the poor. "A penny for the Virgin," he said to the peasants, and the peasants, who barely had enough to eat, gave their pennies with joy. Bartolo collected those humble coins as if they were treasures. With the alms of the poor, brick by brick, a sanctuary would begin to rise that would become one of the most important in the Catholic world. The Virgin Mary was demonstrating that she does not need human riches to work wonders, only generous and trusting hearts. Among the most impactful miracles was that of a noble family from Naples whose only son had become seriously ill. The best doctors in the city had given up on him, giving him only days to live. The mother, in desperation, had heard tales of the miracles occurring in Pompeii, and she decided to take her dying son there as a last hope. The journey was agonizing, the boy moaning in pain with every jolt of the carriage. Upon arriving at the church, barely conscious, he was placed before the image of the Virgin Mary. The mother prayed the entire rosary while holding her son's cold hand. During the last glorious mystery, the young man opened his eyes clearly, asked for water, and to everyone's astonishment, he sat up, saying the pain had vanished. 3 days later, he was walking around Pompeii, completely healthy. This grateful family became one of the primary benefactors of the future sanctuary, demonstrating that the Virgin Mary not only healed bodies, but also touched hearts to join in her work. Chapter 7. Stone upon Stone. On May 8th, 1876, the first stone of the new sanctuary was laid. It was a simple, yet deeply emotional ceremony. Bartolo Longo, surrounded by barefoot farmers and a few wealthy individuals who had believed in his project, blessed the stone with tears in his eyes. He recalled how just a few years prior he had been a satanic priest, and now he was building a temple to the Mother of God. Divine grace could transform even the most corrupted into an instrument of holiness. Construction progressed slowly, at the rhythm of the alms that arrived. Some days there was barely enough to pay the workers. Other days, when the funds were completely depleted, the work stopped, but always mysteriously. A providential donation appeared at just the right moment. A widow would send her savings, a merchant would provide materials, a nobleman would make a generous donation. Bartolo saw in each of these providences the hand of the Virgin Mary, sustaining his work. The architects and engineers overseeing the construction marveled at how this project, which seemed impossible from a financial standpoint, continued against all logic. Bartolo explained to them that the true architect of the sanctuary was not human, but celestial. The Virgin Mary was building her own house with the stones of faith, of the poor and the humble. Every brick laid was an act of trust in divine providence. Countess Mariana de Fusco became Bartolo's great collaborator in this endeavor. This virtuous woman, who had been widowed young, found the meaning of her life in the devotion to the Rosary and in the Sanctuary project. She contributed not only material resources, but also her time, her energy, and her heart. Between her and Bartolo, a deep spiritual friendship developed, based on their common love for the Virgin Mary and their desire to save souls. In 1885, following the advice of Pope Leo III, Bartolo and Countess Mariana entered into a civil marriage to legally regulate their situation as administrators of the charitable works. However, they took a vow to live in perpetual chastity as brother and sister, dedicated exclusively to the service of God and the poor. Their virginal marriage became a testament that the purest love is the one that is completely ordered towards heaven. Together, they continued to raise, stone upon stone, the sanctuary that would change the face of Pompeii. During the construction, several incidents occurred that could have been disastrous, but were providentially resolved without major consequences. On one occasion, a poorly secured scaffold collapsed after the workers had already gone down for lunch, miraculously saving everyone. Another time, a terrible storm threatened to topple the newly erected walls, but the wind changed direction at the last moment. The workers, witnessing these divine interventions, began to pray the Rosary daily. Before starting their work, many of them, who had arrived as simple employees seeking a salary, ended up becoming fervent devotees of the Virgin of Pompeii. Bartolo saw how the sanctuary was not only built with material stones, but also with living stones, the souls that were being transformed day by day in that blessed place. Chapter 8. Apostle of the marginalized, while the sanctuary grew towards the sky. Bartolo Longo did not forget the most abandoned members of society. His own experience of having hit rock bottom had made him sensitive to the suffering of those who lived on the fringes. Orphaned children, especially girls, were easy victims of exploitation and trafficking. Bartolo decided to found an orphanage where these little ones could find a home, education, and maternal love. In 1887, he opened the doors of the Orphanage of Daughters of Prisoners, specifically intended to welcome the daughters of inmates. These innocent children carried the social stigma of their parents' crimes, being rejected and despised by all. Bartolo welcomed them with special tenderness, telling them, "You are not to blame for your parents' mistakes. Here you will find a new family." The girls learned trades, received Christian education, and above all, discovered that they were loved. But Bartolo was not content with helping the children of prisoners. He also wanted to reach the prisoners themselves. He began to visit the prisons of the region, bringing rosaries, words of consolation, and hope to men that society had discarded. Many of those inmates recognized in Bartolo someone who understood them without judging them. He told them about his own dark past, how he had served Satan, and yet God had forgiven him. The testimonies of conversions in the prisons were moving. Hardened criminals wept like children. Upon receiving God's forgiveness in the sacrament of confession, some wrote him letters from their cells, thanking him for restoring their dignity and hope. Bartolo kept those letters as treasures, knowing that each soul rescued from the abyss was a victory over the demon who had once enslaved him. He also founded arts and crafts workshops for poor young people, where they learned carpentry, tailoring, shoemaking, and other worthy trades. He did not simply want to give alms, but to provide means for people to honestly earn a living. His charity was intelligent and practical, attacking the roots of poverty. But in all these projects, the Rosary remained at the center. Every day, in all his orphanages and workshops, the entire Rosary was prayed. Prayer was the soul of every social work. One of the most touching stories was that of a girl named Teresa, the daughter of a murderer sentenced to life imprisonment. The little girl, barely 8 years old, had been rejected by all her relatives and was wandering the streets begging when Bartolo found her. The little girl was so traumatized. She wouldn't speak. She remained mute, her gaze lost and vacant. Bartolo took her to the orphanage and personally spent hours with her, patiently teaching her to pray the Rosary. It was a slow and painful process, but little by little, bead by bead, mystery by mystery, Teresa began to heal. One day, after months of silence, she uttered her first words, "Hail Mary." Bartolo wept with joy. Years later, Teresa became one of the best teachers at the orphanage, dedicating her life to helping other girls who, like her, had known rejection and abandonment. Her testimony proved that there is no wound so deep that the love of the Virgin Mary cannot heal. Chapter 9. The Crown That Unites the World. On May 8th, 1891, the Sanctuary of Our Lady of the Rosary of Pompeii was solemnly consecrated. It was a day of indescribable jubilation. Thousands of pilgrims came from all parts of Italy and beyond. The building, with its imposing bell tower visible from miles away, stood as a beacon of hope in the valley that 15 years earlier had been a spiritual wasteland. The battered painting now occupied the place of honor on a magnificent altar, surrounded by votive offerings of gratitude. Bartolo Longo contemplated the multitude that filled the sanctuary and could scarcely believe what his eyes saw. The former satanic priest had built a temple for the Queen of Heaven. The man who had invoked demons now gathered thousands to praise God. Only divine mercy could work such a transformation. During the consecration, Bartolo prostrated himself before the altar and wept with gratitude, remembering the promise he had heard in the valley. If you propagate the Rosary, you will be saved. The devotion to Our Lady of the Rosary of Pompeii spread rapidly throughout the Catholic world. Bartolo founded a monthly magazine, The Rosary of New Pompeii, which reached all continents. In its pages, he published testimonies of miracles, explanations of the mysteries of the Rosary, and exhortations to prayer. The publication reached circulations of hundreds of thousands of copies, becoming one of the most widely read Catholic newspapers of its time. He especially promoted the supplication to the Virgin of Pompeii, a prayer composed by himself, which should be prayed on May 8th and the first Sunday of October. Millions of Catholics around the world joined together on those days to pray the supplication simultaneously, creating an uninterrupted chain of prayer that encircled the globe. Bartolo had understood that the Rosary was the weapon that the Virgin Mary had given to the Church to combat evil in all its forms. Successive popes blessed and supported the work of Pompeii. Leo III, who had written numerous encyclicals on the Rosary, saw in Bartolo Longo the providential apostle of this devotion. Saint Pius X visited the sanctuary and was deeply moved. The small seed planted with the arms of the peasants had grown into a gigantic tree whose shade protected the entire church. Pompeii had transformed into the world center of devotion to the Rosary, exactly as the Virgin had promised. The international reach of the devotion to the Virgin of Pompeii reached dimensions that no one could have imagined. Letters arrived from places as remote as China, Australia, South America, and Africa, all relating favors received through the intercession of Our Lady of the Rosary of Pompeii. Missionaries wrote telling how newly converted natives fervently prayed the supplication of Pompeii. Sailors attributed their salvation in storms to the Virgin of Pompeii. Mothers gave thanks for the healing of their children. Sinners related miraculous conversions. Bartolo read each of these letters with tears of joy, recognizing that the heavenly promise was being fulfilled, far beyond what he could have dreamed. The Rosary, that simple prayer of beads that had saved his own soul from the satanic abyss, was now saving souls in every corner of the world, weaving a crown of prayer that embraced all of humanity. Chapter 10. Perseverance on the Cross. But the path of Bartolo Longo was not without suffering. Like all the saints, he had to bear his cross. Murmurs and slander began to arise, especially in relation to the administration of the large alms that arrived at the sanctuary. Some accused him of enriching himself personally. Others insinuated irregularities in the handling of funds. The accusations were unfounded, but they hurt deeply. Bartolo was subjected to ecclesiastical and civil investigations. For months, he lived under suspicion and public scrutiny. For a man of honor like him, this was a martyrdom. Some collaborators whom he had considered friends abandoned him. The anti-clerical press took the opportunity to attack him with malice, recalling his satanic past and suggesting that he had never really converted. The old demons of doubt returned to haunt him. Could it be true that his conversion had been false? In the midst of this storm, Bartolo took refuge in the Rosary. He prayed with the same worn beads that he had used since his conversion, the same ones that Father Alberto Radente had given him decades earlier. The Virgin Mary did not abandon him in his tribulation. Finally, all investigations completely absolved him, confirming that he had managed the funds with scrupulous honesty and that his entire life had been one of selfless service. Although he was exonerated, the toll had been enormous. In 1906, Bartolo made a decision that surprised many. He ceded all the charitable works, orphanages, and properties of the sanctuary to the Holy See, renouncing all control over them. He wanted to make it absolutely clear that he had never sought personal power or wealth. The Pope appointed a pontifical delegate to administer the works, and Bartolo retired to the background, dedicating himself mainly to writing articles for the Rosary magazine. The last years of his life were of deep inner peace. The trials had purified his soul like gold in a crucible. His faith had strengthened in the midst of persecution. Bartolo knew that he had fulfilled the mission that the Virgin had entrusted to him that day in the desolate valley. The Rosary had spread throughout the world. Millions of souls had been touched by grace, and he, the former satanic priest, had been the instrument of it all. His salvation was assured, not by his merits, but by the infinite mercy of God. During the darkest period of the accusations, there were times when Bartolo felt the temptation to defend himself publicly, to reveal all the details of his administration, to silence his detractors. But his spiritual director advised silence and humility, reminding him that Christ, too, had been unjustly accused and remained silent before his accusers. This cross of slander, the priest explained, was precisely the final purification God allowed to perfect his holiness. Bartolo accepted this counsel and offered all the humiliations for the conversion of sinners, especially those who, like him in his youth, were trapped in the nets of occultism. Years later, when his innocence was fully demonstrated, those who had slandered him felt ashamed. But Bartolo never held a grudge against them. On the contrary, he prayed for them in his daily rosary, demonstrating that he had learned the most difficult lesson of the gospel: to love your enemies and forgive offenses. Chapter 11. The Triumph of Grace. Bartolo Longo died a holy death on October 5, 1926, at the age of 85. His last words were a final testament to his conversion and his love for the Virgin Mary. "My only desire is to see Mary, who saved me and will save me from the clutches of Satan." He spoke these words with a smile of peace on his lips, looking towards an invisible point in the room, as if he already beheld the Mother of God coming to fetch him. Then he closed his eyes and surrendered his spirit to God. The news of his death spread rapidly throughout the Catholic world. Thousands of people flocked to Pompeii to pay their last respects to the Apostle of the Rosary. The burial was an impressive manifestation of love and veneration. The orphans he had taken in wept inconsolably. The farmers of Pompeii had lost their spiritual father. Pilgrims from all over the world felt that a light had been extinguished. Over the following decades, the fame of Bartolo Longo's holiness grew steadily. Testimonials of favors obtained through his intercession multiplied. In 1980, Pope St. John Paul II beatified him in a solemn ceremony, proclaiming him Apostle of the Rosary. The Polish Pope, who had a special devotion to the Virgin Mary, saw in Bartolo Longo a luminous example of conversion and total surrender. The canonization process continued to advance. In February 2025, Pope Francis approved a miracle attributed to the intercession of Blessed Bartolo Longo, thus opening the way for his canonization. Finally, on October 19, 2025, Pope Leo XIV proclaimed him a saint in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, along with 6 other blesseds. The Church elevated to the altars a man who had been a satanic priest, demonstrating that there is no sinner so great that he cannot achieve holiness. The story of Saint Bartolo Longo is a message of hope for all sinners. It teaches us that the past, however dark, does not determine the future when we open ourselves to the grace of God. It shows us that the Virgin Mary is a mother of mercy who does not reject anyone, no matter how lost they may be. And it reveals to us the power of the Holy Rosary as a spiritual weapon capable of vanquishing the devil and transforming lives. The satanic priest became a saint because he trusted in Mary's promise: if you propagate the Rosary, you will be saved. And that promise remains in effect for each of us today. At the canonization ceremony in 2025, Pope Leo XIV pronounced words that resonated throughout Christendom. Bartolo Longo is living proof that the mercy of God knows no limits. Whoever thinks he has fallen too low to be forgiven, let him look at this saint. Whoever believes that his past is too dark to be redeemed, let him contemplate his life from the depths of Satanism to the heights of holiness. Bartolo Longo traveled the longest road imaginable, and he did it with a rosary in his hands. May his example inspire all who feel lost to never think it's too late to return to God. Thousands of pilgrims present in St. Peter's Square wept with emotion, many of them carrying rosaries that had been blessed in Pompeii. The message was clear and powerful. The most radical conversion is possible. Holiness is within everyone's reach, and Mary's Rosary is the sure path to it. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Bartolo Longo. O glorious Saint Bartolo Longo, Apostle of the Holy Rosary, you who knew the depths of the abyss and the heights of holiness, hear the supplication of one who comes to you in this hour of need. You were a priest of darkness, and you became an apostle of light. You were a slave of Satan, and you transformed yourself into a beloved son of Mary. Your life is a living testimony that no sin is so great that the mercy of God cannot forgive. I beseech you, my saint, to intercede for me before the throne of God Almighty, just as you experienced liberation from the power of the devil. Obtain for me the grace to break the chains of sin that bind me. If I have fallen into the clutches of evil, lift me up. If I have lost hope, restore it to me. If I have forgotten the love of God, remind me. You who were rescued from the thickest darkness, obtain for me the light I need to find the way back to the Father's house. Saint Bartolo, patron of desperate and seemingly impossible causes, present my intentions before the Virgin Mary. Teach me to pray the Rosary with the same faith with which you prayed it when you were barely a repentant sinner seeking salvation. Help me to understand that in the beads of the Rosary lies the secret of victory over evil. Obtain for me the grace to persevere in daily prayer, trusting that the Mother of God will save me as she saved you. Protect especially the young people who are being tempted by occultism, spiritualism, witchcraft, and all forms of satanic worship. You knew that path of perdition, and you know where it leads. Illuminate their minds so that they understand the deadly deception into which they are falling. Strengthen the families who suffer because some of their members have strayed from the faith. Console the parents who weep for children lost in darkness. And to all those who feel unworthy of God's forgiveness, show them your example. If God forgave you, he can forgive anyone. Saint Bartolo Longo, builder of the Sanctuary of Pompeii, also build in my heart a temple worthy of the Holy Spirit. Just as you transformed a desolate valley into a world pilgrimage center, transform my barren life into a flourishing garden of virtues. Obtain for me the graces that I need at this moment, and when my last hour arrives, come yourself to accompany me, along with the Virgin Mary, so that I too can say as you did, my only desire is to see Mary, who saved me and will save me from the clutches of Satan. Amen. Our Lady of the Rosary of Pompeii, pray for us. Saint Bartolo Longo, pray for us.